October 1986. The Jalalabad Highway, Afghanistan. Dawn light bleeds over the jagged Hindu Kush peaks, casting long, cold shadows across the gravel plain. The air is still and sharp with dust. A Soviet motorized rifle column, a snake of BTR-60s and T-62 tanks, grinds along the worn road, their diesel thunder the only sound for miles. Inside a command BTR, a young lieutenant scans the barren ridges through his periscope. It is routine, it is secure. They own the day. From the west, a new sound slices the morning, not the familiar thudding rotor beat of their own Mi-24 Hinds. This is higher, sharper, a piercing whine. On the horizon, two dark specks materialize, skimming the earth, using the terrain itself as a shield. They are angular, almost insect-like, unfamiliar. The column commander, a veteran of Stalingrad's grandson, chuckles into his radio. Duraki. He orders his ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft vehicle to track but not fire. A curiosity. The specks dip behind a low ridge. Vanish. For 3 heartbeats there is only the rumble of treads. Then hell erupts from silent space. A flash, not from the sky, but from the ridgeline, a streak of smoke and fire. The lead T-62 jerks violently as its turret is peeled open by a supersonic dart. A second later, the sound hits, a deafening crack-whump of high-explosive anti-tank warheads finding their mark. The Shilka explodes before its radar can lock, consumed in a fireball of its own ammunition. The angular machines now rise, hovering like avenging wasps. Rocket pods ripple fire, walking lines of explosions through the convoy. There is no machine gun chatter from these aircraft, only the precise, surgical thump, thump, thump of guided missiles and rockets. In minutes, the column is a chain of molten steel and fuel-fed pyres. The laughter in the command vehicle has died. The lieutenant stares at the carnage, the unfamiliar silhouette of the killer etched against the sun. This was not a rebel ambush. This was a demonstration, a message written in fire and delivered from the sky, paid for in American dollars and answered with Soviet blood. The Soviet High Command would soon receive the after-action reports. The assessment was a silent, brutal shock. The technological monopoly they had taken for granted was over. The toys had become hunters. To understand the shock of that morning on the Jalalabad road, one must first inhabit the mindset of the Soviet military machine in December 1979. Its confidence was absolute, forged in the colossal victory over Nazi Germany and tempered in the Cold War's relentless technological arms race. The Soviet Union did not just possess a military, it operated a doctrine, a seamless, industrialized theory of victory known as the Operational Maneuver Group. War was a matter of scale, speed, and overwhelming mass. Tanks were the spearhead, artillery the hammer, and tactical air power, epitomized by their own formidable Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship, was the sweeping hand that cleared the path. When the Politburo made the decision to intervene in Afghanistan, it was not seen as a war, but a limited operation, a political stabilization. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, DRA government, a communist ally, was fracturing. President Hafizullah Amin was deemed unreliable. The mission was surgical: remove Amin, install the compliant Babrak Karmal, secure key urban centers and lines of communication, and depart. In Soviet military calculus, they were a partisan irritant, not a strategic threat. On December 24, 1979, the machinery activated. At Termez, on the Soviet-Afghan border, the 108th Motorized Rifle Division began crossing the pontoon bridges over the Amu Darya River. The water reflected the eerie green glow of chemical lights, illuminating a river of steel. BMD infantry fighting vehicles, T-62 and T-72 tanks, and massive Mi-6 helicopters ferrying artillery pieces slung beneath their bellies. The first soldiers wore DRA uniforms, a thin disguise. The air was thick with diesel exhaust and the metallic tension of an army moving in full combat array, yet expecting no battle. Their objectives were the airfields and palaces of Kabul. Their mindset was one of garrison duty. 48 hours later, Operation Storm 333 culminated at the Taj Beg Palace. Soviet Special Forces, Spetsnaz from the Alpha Group and the 154th Detachment stormed the complex. In a brutal, close-quarters firefight lasting less than an hour, President Amin was killed. By dawn on December 27th, Kabul was under Soviet control. Broadcasts announced the fraternal aid of the Soviet Union. The world watched, stunned. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter, grappled with the intelligence failure and the stark new map of Cold War confrontation. In Langley and Islamabad, plans that were embryonic began to harden into resolve. The initial Soviet occupation followed the Doctrine script. They secured the key terrain of cities, major highways like the Salang Pass, and air bases, 303 Lee Enfields and the occasional RPG-7. 7mm Yak-B Gatling gun, such resistance seemed pathetic. Soviet commanders, many seasoned from exercises on the European plains, viewed the mountainous landscape as a mere logistical hurdle, not a decisive combatant. Victory was measured in tonnage of supplies moved, kilometres of road secured. There was in the officers' mess halls and command posts a palpable, dismissive confidence. They had pacified Eastern Europe. They would pacify this. This confidence was most visually embodied in the Mi-24 Hind. It was not a mere helicopter. It was a flying infantry fighting vehicle, a symbol of Soviet martial prowess. It could carry 8 fully armed troops, yet was armoured, fast, and armed with a devastating array of rockets, guns, and anti-tank missiles. To Soviet generals, the Hind was attack helicopter supremacy. The idea that a technologically superior machine could be fielded against them by a peasant force in rags was not just improbable, it was a joke. Their laughter on the Jalalabad highway was the last echo of that December 1979 certainty, a certainty that was already rotting from within. For even as the Soviet tank columns rolled south, a counter-geometry was being drawn in the mountains. The Mujahideen, driven by faith and a fierce tradition of independence, were coalescing. And 7,000 kilometers away, in the corridors of the White House and CIA headquarters, a calculated decision was made to make the Soviet Union bleed. The instrument of that hemorrhage would not be American soldiers, but American technology, funneled through a silent pipeline running from Langley to Islamabad into the arms of the Afghan resistance. The first seeds of the Jalalabad ambush were sown not in 1986, but in the first stunned weeks of 1980. The Soviet consolidation in 1980 was a mapmaker's victory. Control looked solid on paper, a network of garrisons, air bases and paved highways. But the spaces between those lines, the vast roadless mountains, the labyrinthine valleys, the thousands of isolated villages, were a vacuum. And nature, along with history, abhors a vacuum. Into this void flowed the Mujahideen. They were not a unified army, but a constellation of rivalrous, often fractious parties based across the border in Peshawar, Pakistan. Their strength lay in their utter dissolution into the human and physical terrain. They were farmers by day, fighters by night. They moved along goat trails invisible from the air, supported by kinship networks that no KGB informant could fully penetrate. The initial Soviet response was mechanistic and brutal. If an area supported the rebels, it was made an example. Village-based counterinsurgency gave way to Zakistka, clearing operations. Columns would surround a suspect village. Houses would be searched, often looted. Any military-aged male found could be detained or shot. Grain stores were burned, livestock slaughtered, and irrigation systems destroyed. The strategy was one of deprivation and terror, designed to sever the link between the population and the guerrillas. But in a culture defined by honour, blood feud and Pashtunwali, the code of the Pashtuns, it had the opposite effect. Each destroyed home created 10 new Mujahideen. Each civilian death forged an unbreakable bond of vengeance. Soviet air power, particularly the Hind, became the omnipresent symbol of this oppression. It was the sound of approaching annihilation. A Mi-24 could appear from behind a ridge, its rockets flattening a mud brick compound before its victims even heard the rotors. It was invulnerable to the Mujahideen's small arms. The psychological impact was profound, but it also sowed a deep, specific hatred, a focused desire for a weapon that could reach out and claw this metallic bird from the sky. The Mujahideen learned to move at dawn and dusk in poor weather, but the constraint chafed. They needed an equalizer. This need found a willing answer in Washington and Islamabad. President Carter's initial covert finding in 1979 to provide non-lethal aid to the Mujahideen was swiftly overtaken by events. With the Soviet invasion, the calculus changed. Under CIA Director William Casey, a fervent anti-communist, the program escalated into a major lethal covert action. The goal was explicit: to raise the cost of the Soviet occupation to unsustainable levels. Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, under General Akhtar Abdur Rahman, became the essential conduit. The CIA would provide the money and the global procurement network. The ISI would handle the logistics, training, and distribution to the chosen Afghan resistance parties. It was a marriage of convenience, with the Pakistani aim of securing strategic depth against India, neatly aligning with the American desire to bloody the Soviets. The early weaponry was pragmatic, deniable, and globally sourced. Egyptian and Chinese variants of the Soviet Kalashnikov, so rebels could use captured ammunition. Belgian FN Fail rifles, Italian mortars, British blowpipe surface-to-air missiles. The first generation of man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, arrived. The British blowpipe and the early Soviet SA-7 Grail, sourced from third parties. These were problematic. The SA-7 had a limited engagement envelope, chasing tailpipe heat, and could be defeated by simple helicopter flares. The blowpipe was complex and cumbersome. Soviet pilots grew adept at tactics to defeat them, flaring, maneuvering, attacking from certain angles. The loss rate was manageable. In the Kremlin and in Soviet field headquarters, the assessment remained. The Mujahideen were a serious nuisance, but technologically, they were still in the Stone Age. The helicopter, particularly the Hind, reigned supreme. This was the dangerous plateau of the early 1980s, a grinding stalemate of atrocity and resistance. The Soviet 40th Army settled into a grim rhythm of seasonal offensives, most notably into the Panjshir Valley against the legendary commander Ahmad Shah Massoud. They would pour in troops and bombs, claim victory and withdraw, only for Massoud's forces to filter back in. Each cycle cost lives and drained morale, but changed little. The Soviet military bureaucracy reported progress. The political leadership in Moscow, under a succession of ailing general secretaries, demanded results. And in the shadows, the American-Pakistani pipeline continued to flow, its contents growing ever more sophisticated, waiting for the technological key that would unlock the helicopter's dominance. The stage was set not for a battle, but for a demonstration. A violent lesson in the evolution of warfare that would first echo through the mountains of the Panjshir before arriving on the flat, deadly stretch of the Jalalabad Highway. This concludes the context and background section. The stage is now set to explore the specific angles of this conflict, the opposing mindsets, the technology, and the human agents of change. The Soviet officers' laughter at the unfamiliar helicopters was not merely personal ignorance. It was the product of a closed, rigid system. The Red Army of the 1980s was a hierarchy built on the bedrock of World War II victory and a deep-seated belief in mass and combined arms. Its doctrine was designed for the European Central Front, a high-intensity conflict against NATO, fought with armoured divisions across the plains of Germany. In this calculus, helicopters were a supporting asset, a component of the descent, air assault operations, or for flank security. The idea of a helicopter as a primary war-winning weapon system operating independently in an anti-tank role was a Western, primarily American, concept. To the Soviet General Staff, it was a doctrinal novelty, not a proven paradigm. This intellectual closure was reinforced by the Soviet system itself. Intelligence on Western capabilities was filtered through the prism of political ideology and institutional bias. Reports on the new American AH-64 Apache, which began development in the mid-1970s, would have been analysed, but the assessment likely downplayed its revolutionary fire control systems and survivability, focusing instead on its cost and complexity, flaws that confirmed Soviet beliefs about capitalist military inefficiency. Their own Mi-24 was a testament to a different philosophy. Robust, versatile, and built in staggering numbers. It was a flying tank, intimidating and effective in the ground support role they had defined for it. The concept that a more specialized, agile helicopter could render their armored columns obsolete seemed absurd. Their arrogance was, in a sense, a failure of imagination, locked in by a doctrine that had no answer for a war it never planned to fight. While the Soviets were mired in doctrine, the United States was engaging in a cold, calculated calculus of proxy warfare. The CIA's covert action program in Afghanistan, dubbed Operation Cyclone, was not a charity. It was a strategic lever. But to do that, the Mujahideen needed to shift from survivable resistance to credible threat. They needed to attack the symbols of Soviet power, the helicopter gunships and the armoured columns. The turning point in this technological transfer came with the decision to provide the FEM-92 Stinger missile in 1986. But the Stinger was the culmination, not the beginning. The path was paved by earlier incremental advances. The Swiss-designed Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft cannon, man-portable in sections, gave the Mujahideen their first truly effective area denial weapon against low-flying aircraft. More critically was the provision of sophisticated anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs. The British Milan, and most notably the American BGM-71 TOW, tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile system, began to filter in. The TOW was a revolution. It was a crew-served semi-automatic command line-of-sight S-Saklos weapon. The gunner simply had to keep his crosshairs on the target. The missile flew itself along the wire, capable of piercing over 600mm of armour from over 3 kilometres away. It was this weapon, the TOW, that first truly decimated Soviet tank columns from standoff ranges, often from concealed mountain slopes. The success of the TOW created the necessary precondition for the helicopter gambit. It proved the Mujahideen could be trained on complex Western systems. It demonstrated that with the right technology, terrain could be turned into a fortress, and it forced Soviet armour to become more cautious, often bunching up for mutual support, a fatal error when the next technological leap arrived from the sky. The CIA and ISI weren't just sending weapons, they were conducting a live field experiment in asymmetric warfare, with each new system testing a specific Soviet weakness. The attack helicopter was the logical, terrifying apex of that experiment. The clash over Afghanistan was, on a technological level, a confrontation between two philosophies of air power. The Soviet Mi-24 Hind, entering service in 1972, was a product of the flying infantry fighting vehicle concept. Its design prioritized versatility and shock effect. 7mm Gatling gun in a chin turret. Its wings provided hardpoints for a staggering load of unguided rocket pods, bombs, or early-model anti-tank missiles like the AT-2 Swatter. It was fast for a helicopter, capable of over 200 knots. In a low-threat environment, it was a terrifyingly effective tool of suppression, but its design compromises were its Achilles heel. It was large, with a high disk loading, making it less agile at low speeds. Its sensors were rudimentary. Targeting was often visual or reliant on ground laser designation. It was built to survive small arms fire, not sophisticated air defenses. Conversely, the American AH-64 Apache, which began development in 1975 and entered service in 1986, was conceived from the keel up as a dedicated tank killer. It embodied the standoff attack doctrine born from the lessons of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Every element of its design served this single, ruthless purpose. Its most revolutionary feature was the Target Acquisition and Designation Sight, TADS, and Pilot Night Vision System, PNVS, mounted on its nose. This gave the gunner and pilot independent, stabilized, long-range thermal and optical sights, allowing them to identify and engage targets from kilometers away, day or night, in poor weather. Its primary weapon was the Hellfire missile, a fire-and-forget weapon guided by a laser seeker. The Apache could pop up from behind cover, launch a Hellfire, and retreat before the target even knew it was under attack. It carried a 30mm M230 chain gun under its chin, linked to the gunner's helmet-mounted sight. Where he looked, the gun aimed. It was smaller, more agile, and incorporated signature reduction features. While the Hind was a broadsword, the Apache was a scalpel. It is critical to note that the CIA did not supply the Mujahideen with AH-64 Apaches. That is a historical myth. The Mujahideen's attack helicopters were a mix of provided and captured systems. The primary Western-supplied machine was the lighter, older AH-1 Cobra, provided via third parties and, more commonly, advanced variants of the very Soviet Mi-24 Hind itself. Through the ISI, the CIA facilitated the acquisition of Hind helicopters from various sources, including nations that had captured them or sought to dispose of them. These Hinds were then refurbished, often fitted with Western avionics and weapons pods, and operated by highly trained non-Afghan pilots, Pakistanis, Arabs, and mercenaries under the umbrella of the ISI. This created a surreal, symbolic battlefield, Soviet pilots in their Hinds facing off against nearly identical machines flown by proxy forces but guided by Western tactical concepts and, at times, Western targeting intelligence. The technological shock was not just facing a better machine, but facing their own machine, perfected and turned against them. The most sensitive layer of this angle was not the machine, but the man in its cockpit. The average Mujahideen fighter, however brave, could not be trained to operate a complex attack helicopter in a matter of weeks. This created a silent, deniable tier of combatants within the conflict. To crew these sophisticated aircraft, the ISI and their partners drew from a pool of professionals: pilots from the Pakistan Air Force on secondment, volunteers from other Muslim nations like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and even a shadowy cadre of Western mercenaries and former military pilots hired through private defense contractors. These men were not tribal guerrillas; they were technicians of death, operating far from the ideological fervour of the mountain fighter. Their battles were not for a village or a valley, but for the control of airspace and the psychological shattering of Soviet armoured doctrine. Training for these proxy pilots was conducted in secure facilities in Pakistan and sometimes in third countries. They learned not just to fly the aircraft, but to employ it according to NATO-style tactics, using nap of the earth (NOE) flying to mask their approach, employing terrain for ambush, prioritizing high-value targets like command vehicles and anti-aircraft assets first. They were taught to think like system managers, integrating intelligence from CIA-provided satellite imagery and signals intercepts into their mission planning. "We would receive coordinates," he said. A column was moving from point A to point B at a certain time. We knew its composition: tanks, APCs, fuel trucks. Our job was to be at a certain map grid at a certain minute, use the terrain, and execute the engagement profile. It was mathematical. The Soviets were predictable. They moved their columns the same way, on the same roads, with the same spacing. They were creatures of habit. This human layer, the cold, professional application of overwhelming technology, transformed the helicopter from a mere aircraft into a precision strike system. The laughter of the Soviet commander died because he was not facing an angry farmer with a rocket. He was facing a calculated corporate-style military execution delivered from the sky. The turning point was not a single thunderclap, but a rolling storm of events across 2 years. It began in the crucible of the Panjshir Valley. They launched their largest offensive to date, Operation Panjshir 7. It involved over 15,000 Soviet and DRA troops, supported by an unprecedented concentration of air power, squadrons of Su-25 Frogfoot ground attack jets, and swarms of Mi-24 Hinds. The strategy was one of annihilation: to seal the valley, then systematically destroy every pocket of resistance. For the first week, the offensive followed the old script. Soviet airmobile troops seized high ground. Armoured columns ground up the valley floor. Massoud's forces, following his doctrine of strategic patience, melted away into subsidiary valleys and high mountain redoubts. They avoided large set-piece battles. But this time, when the Hind squadrons swept into strafe and rocket-suspected positions, they were met with a new, deadly welcome. From concealed rock nests on the valley slopes, Mujahideen teams manned their newly acquired Swiss Oerlikon 20mm cannons and, more importantly, the first batches of sophisticated manpads, the British blowpipe, and crucially, the American FEM-43 Red-Eye. The Red-Eye was a first-generation tail-chase heat-seeker, but in the confines of the valley, against helicopters manoeuvring at low speed and low altitude, it was lethal. A Hind, flaring and twisting to avoid one missile, would present its hot engine exhaust to a gunner on the opposite slope. The Soviet pilots, trained for anti-partisan sweeps, not integrated air defense environments, suffered shocking losses. In one documented engagement, 3 Hinds were downed in a single hour over the village of Rokha. The wrecks, smoking on the valley floor, became instant symbols. For the Mujahideen, they were trophies of a new capability. For the Soviet air crews, it was the first crack in the myth of invincibility. The psychological impact within the 40th Army's aviation regiments was immediate and corrosive. Pre-mission bravado gave way to tense briefings. Pilots now flew with one eye on their instruments, another constantly scanning the ridges for the telltale smoke trail of a manpad's launch. The tactics of overwhelming low-altitude presence were no longer viable. They were forced higher, making their rocket and gun attacks less accurate, or to adopt high-speed diving attacks that reduced their time over target and increased their vulnerability to other ground fire. The initiative, the sense of omnipresent threat that the Hinds had once imposed, was now reversed. The hunter was becoming the hunted. This shift in the air directly empowered Massoud's ground forces. With Soviet air power muted, they could move more freely in daylight. They began employing their new anti-tank weapons, the Milan and TOW missiles, with devastating effect against the advancing columns, which were now deprived of their close air support umbrella. Operation Panjshir VII ended, like its predecessors, with a Soviet withdrawal and claims of victory. But the after-action reports reaching Moscow told a different story. The casualty figures for aircraft, particularly helicopters, were unsustainable. The Mujahideen were no longer just harassing. They were developing a combined arms capability of their own, built around a backbone of Western-supplied, precision-guided weapons. The warning was clear, but institutional inertia and political face-saving prevented a fundamental reassessment. The lesson of the Panjshir was noted, but not fully learned. The stage was now set for a more public, more humiliating demonstration on a flat, open road where the Soviets felt most secure. The highway from Kabul to Jalalabad was the 40th Army's vital artery, a strip of paved order through a chaotic land. Convoys along it were routine, heavily armed, and considered secure. The surrounding terrain was not the close kill zone of the Panjshir. It was open gravel plain, rising to distant, rocky ridges, terrain that favoured the defender with long sightlines, but also gave armoured columns room to manoeuvre and anti-aircraft guns clear fields of fire. It was textbook ground for a modern, mechanised force. On that September morning, a reinforced Soviet motorised rifle battalion was conducting a resupply run to the garrison at Jalalabad. The column was a textbook formation. T-62 main battle tanks at the front and rear, BTR-80 armoured personnel carriers and logistics trucks in the centre, with a ZSU-23-4 Shilka radar-guided anti-aircraft vehicle placed strategically in the middle. Scouts in BRDM vehicles ranged ahead. It was a display of disciplined, predictable power. The column commander, Lieutenant Colonel Igor Yershov, radioed in his routine situation reports. All was normal. What Yershov did not know was that his column's schedule and composition were not a secret. Through a combination of human intelligence from local sympathizers and likely signals intercepts facilitated by CIA-provided equipment, the Mujahideen command in the region had detailed foreknowledge. This was not a chance ambush. It was a planned intercept. And the weapon chosen for the intercept was not a TOW team on a ridge. It was air power. The two aircraft that engaged were not the mythical AH-64 Apaches, but they represented the same doctrinal revolution. They were almost certainly heavily modified Mi-24 Hinds, operated by the proxy pilots of the ISI program. These helicopters had been stripped of troop-carrying capability and refined into pure gunships. They were fitted with superior Western avionics for navigation and targeting, and their weapons pylons carried mixes of high-explosive anti-tank heat rockets and, critically, first-generation anti-tank guided missiles like the European HOT, or possibly even early TOW variants adapted for aerial launch. They were flown by crews who had trained specifically for the anti-armour ambush profile. The engagement unfolded with clinical precision. The Hinds did not approach from the predictable axis of the road. Using the distant ridges as a radar shadow, they flew nap of the earth, their rotors kicking up dust from the desert floor, masking their approach until the last possible moment. They popped up simultaneously from behind a low, rocky outcrop to the column's flank, not from the front or rear. Their first priority was not the tanks, but the air defence. A salvo of rockets, guided by a stabilized sight, walked directly into the Shilka. The vehicle disappeared in a catastrophic secondary explosion as its magazine of 23mm shells cooked off. In the opening seconds of the ambush, the column's dedicated anti-aircraft shield was obliterated. Chaos erupted. The column's return fire was wild, uncoordinated. T-62 tank commanders scrambled to traverse their turrets, but the agile Hinds had already shifted position. From a hover at over 2 kilometers range, a distance where the tank's machine guns were ineffective and their main guns useless against a small, moving aerial target, the helicopter gunners began to pick apart the column. Missiles streaked out, not the unguided rockets of Soviet Doctrine, but guided projectiles. One T-62 took a hit on its turret ring, shearing it clean off its hull. A BTR-80 was struck amidships, its aluminum armour offering no resistance, becoming an instant funeral pyre for the infantry squad inside. The fuel trucks at the column's heart were targeted last, creating a wall of fire that trapped the remaining vehicles. The entire engagement lasted less than 8 minutes. When the two Hinds banked away and faded back into the thermal haze of the desert, they left behind a scene of utter devastation. Over a dozen armoured vehicles and trucks were destroyed or burning. Soviet casualties were severe. The few surviving infantry, stunned and leaderless, scrambled for cover in a landscape that offered none. The after-action report that reached Marshal Sergei Sokolov, the Soviet Minister of Defense, was a damning indictment. The language was cold, technical, and terrifying. It confirmed the unthinkable. The Mujahideen now owned a segment of the battlespace, the low-altitude aerial domain, that the Soviet Union had considered its exclusive property. The technological asymmetry had not just been closed, it had been inverted on a key Soviet route. The laughter was gone, replaced by a cold, sobering realization. This was no longer a counterinsurgency. It was a proxy war against a peer adversary's technology, and they were losing. The immediate aftermath of the Jalalabad ambush and the cumulative shock of the 1986 fighting season sent seismic tremors through the Soviet military bureaucracy. The initial reaction in the field was one of paralysis, followed by a frantic and often poorly conceived scramble for countermeasures. Tactical doctrines that had ossified over decades were torn up overnight. The simple act of moving a column from one garrison to another was now recalculated as a high-risk combat operation. New draconian standard operating procedures were imposed. No significant movement could occur without pre-planned, overwhelming air cover. But the nature of that cover changed. Mi-24 Hinds, once the aggressive spearhead, were now relegated to high-altitude overwatch, their effectiveness drastically reduced. The burden fell to fixed-wing aircraft like the Su-25 Frogfoot and even high-altitude bombers, which saturated suspected ambush zones with unguided bombs and napalm before a column would dare to move. This was a costly, fuel-intensive, and often indiscriminate response that further alienated the population and did little to stop well-concealed pop-up attacks. Convoy commanders began to avoid predictable routes and schedules, but in a country with limited road infrastructure, options were few. The operational tempo of the entire 40th Army began to slow, gummed up by its own new layers of caution. Technologically, the Soviet system revealed its inherent inflexibility. There was no quick field fix for the Mi-24's vulnerability to modern manpads and standoff attack. A crash program to upgrade the Hind with better countermeasures like the Lipa infrared jammer and more flare dispensers was accelerated, but these were defensive band-aids. The much more advanced Mi-28 Havoc attack helicopter was still years from service. In the interim, the Soviet High Command made a telling, desperate gesture. They began deploying their own newest generation of anti-tank helicopters to Afghanistan, the Mi-8-derived Mi-17, outfitted with the Sturm missile system. It was an admission that the Heinz design philosophy had failed in this new environment. They were now imitating the very concept of the agile, standoff tank killer they had once derided. The psychological impact on the Soviet soldier, the Afghanets, was profound and corrosive. The contract of trust between the soldier and his technology had been broken. The tank was no longer a fortress. It was a steel coffin, vulnerable to an unseen enemy who could kill from 3 kilometers away. The helicopter was no longer a guardian angel. It was a potential casualty, staying high and distant. Letters home from the front in late 1986 and 1987 speak of a new kind of fear. Not of close combat, but of a silent, scientific death. "They see us before we see them," one soldier wrote. "They have clocks that tell them where we will be." Morale, already strained by years of a purposeless war, entered a terminal decline. Desertions and dedovshchina, brutal hazing, increased. The army was becoming a hollow force, besieged not just by the Mujahideen, but by its own obsolescence. In Moscow, the political ramifications were crystallizing. The new General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had come to power in 1985, promising reform and glasnost, was presented with the grim military assessments. The war was consuming billions of rubles and thousands of young lives with no strategic end in sight. The Politburo, once unified on the necessity of the mission, fractured. The military leadership could no longer promise victory, only a request for more troops, more equipment, and more time. Gorbachev, looking at a Soviet economy buckling under the strain of the arms race, made a historic calculation. The war was not just a military stalemate. It was now an existential threat to his reforms and to the USSR itself. In a televised address in February 1988, he would make the stunning announcement: the Soviet Union would begin a unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan. The decision was political, but it was forged in the fire of military failure, a failure proven on the shattered tarmac of the Jalalabad road. The announcement of withdrawal did not end the war. It unleashed its most violent and politically chaotic phase. The period from 1988 to the final Soviet departure in February 1989 was a bloody covering action, a fighting retreat under constant, intensified pressure. The Mujahideen, sensing victory and flooded with even greater quantities of advanced weaponry, including the now ubiquitous Stinger missiles, pressed every advantage. Soviet and DRA convoys retreating north through the Salang Pass ran a gauntlet of fire. The skies, which the Soviets had once owned, became truly contested. Stinger teams, now expertly deployed, achieved a fearsome kill rate against Soviet fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters attempting to cover the withdrawal. S-proxy strategy had systematically dismantled every pillar of Soviet military dominance. The human and material cost was finalized in grim statistics. The Soviet Union officially admitted to 15,051 dead, 53,753 wounded, and 417 missing. Western estimates often run higher. The financial cost was catastrophic, estimated at over 50 billion rubles, a hemorrhage that accelerated the Soviet economic collapse. The 40th Army left behind a country in ruins, over 1 million Afghan dead, 5 million refugees, and an infrastructure utterly shattered. But they also left behind a monstrous legacy of hardware, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, small arms, and, importantly, hundreds of helicopters and aircraft now in the hands of a fractious, victorious Mujahideen coalition. The very tools of Soviet power became the seeds of future conflict. The blowback was immediate and profound. For the United States and Pakistan, the victory was Pyrrhic. They had succeeded in bleeding the Soviet Union, but the forces they had unleashed were beyond their control. The pipeline of money, weapons, and ideological fervor had created a hardened, globalized jihadist movement. The Arab volunteers who had fought alongside the Mujahideen, including a young Osama bin Laden, took the experience, the networks, and the sense of divine victory back to their home countries. The CIA's greatest victory had midwifed its greatest future threat. Pakistan found itself not with a stable, friendly Afghanistan, but with a chaotic, warring state on its border, flooded with weapons and militant ideology that would soon seep back into its own society, destabilizing it for generations. For the Soviet military, the defeat was a trauma from which it never recovered. The war shredded the prestige of the Red Army. The returning Afghansi were not hailed as heroes, but were often shunned, a painful reminder of a national failure. The institutional lessons of the war, the failure of conscript armies in counterinsurgency, the vulnerability of legacy equipment to smart weapons, the critical need for network-centric warfare and professional soldiers were studied, but the disintegrating Soviet state lacked the resources or will to implement them. The military's humiliation in Afghanistan directly contributed to its passivity during the collapse of the USSR in 1991. The generals who had laughed were now silent, their institution broken by the very technological arrogance they had embodied. In Afghanistan, the aftermath was a descent into a new darkness. The common enemy was gone. Its strategic objective achieved, disengaged almost entirely, abandoning the country to its fate. The ISI's favoured factions, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e-Islami, turned the CIA-supplied weapons on their rival Mujahideen factions. The civil war that followed was even more destructive than the Soviet occupation, paving the way for the rise of the Taliban, who would eventually provide sanctuary to the al-Qaeda network built on the foundations of the anti-Soviet jihad. The cycle of blowback was complete. The weapons sent to destroy one empire had created the conditions for a new global conflict. The story that began with the rumble of tanks on the Amu Darya Bridge ends not with a peace treaty, but with an echo of rotor blades, first the confident thud of the Hind, then the piercing whine of its more lethal successors. The Soviet-Afghan War was the last colonial war of the industrial age and the first postmodern conflict of the information era. It was a laboratory. In its mountains and deserts, the fundamental equation of modern warfare was rewritten. The laughter of the Soviet generals was the final, fading echo of a 19th century mindset meeting a 21st century reality. They believed in the immutable physics of mass: more steel, more shells, more men. But their opponents, guided by a foreign intelligence service, introduced a new physics of precision: better sensors, smarter munitions, and the standoff kill. The tank column, that symbol of 20th century land power, was rendered obsolescent not by a superior tank but by a system, a combination of satellite intelligence, encrypted communications, a man in a headset on a distant ridge, and a missile that flew unerringly down a laser beam. The helicopter ambush on the Jalalabad road was not an anomaly, it was a demonstration of a new principle. Warfare had shifted from a contest of attrition to a contest of information, yet this reflection carries a profound and chilling duality. The very technology that proved so decisive was ethically and strategically hollow. It was a victory of capability over cause, of means without sustainable ends. The United States mastered the art of the remote, prosthetic war, delivering devastating force through proxies with deniable precision. But in doing so, it lost all control over the political aftermath. The Stinger missile that saved a Mujahideen group one day would be turned on a civilian airliner or against American forces decades later. The clever, cynical gambit of Operation Cyclone solved a short-term Cold War problem by creating a long-term epoch of nihilistic violence. The weapons were smart, the strategy was not. Ultimately, the war stands as a grim monument to miscalculation. The Soviets miscalculated the resilience of faith and terrain. The Americans miscalculated the consequences of unleashing an ideology alongside the weapons. And in the middle, the people of Afghanistan paid the price in a currency of endless ruin. The helicopter, therefore, becomes more than a machine. It is the symbol of this tragic irony, a tool of breathtaking tactical brilliance that served a depth of strategic folly. It is the harbinger of our contemporary world, a world where killing has become ever more efficient and understanding ever more elusive. The final lesson of those burning tanks is not about which helicopter is better. It is a warning that in the modern age, no victory is ever as clean and no defeat is ever as final as it appears through the crosshairs.